Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our lecture series on the political history of modern Japan. And I'm very excited about our topic for today, which is a history of the political right and especially the far right in post-war Japan. Probably we've all seen, if we're in Japan, or we've seen pictures of Japanese right-wing sound trucks, these black trucks flying the old imperial Japanese Navy flag, and blasting this like old-time militaristic music out of their speakers and driving around town. It's a pretty common sight in Tokyo, for instance, especially, and it receives, some attention in foreign media as well. So probably we have an image of some of these groups, but I feel like not a lot is really known about who they are and maybe perhaps even their differing ideologies. In fact, I really think we need a good study of the history of the Japanese right wing in English. I don't know of one that really extensively covers this, and I certainly won't be able to give as much information in this talk as a book length study would be able to do. But I'm going to get into some essays that do cover the topic and present just a little bit of the work that has been done that I know of that kind of catalogs the history, the post-war history of the Japanese far right. Okay, so the title of my talk is Post-War Japan and the Political Right. And I want to start out by talking about the right's connection to Kokutai ideology. And Kokutai means national polity or national body, literally. It has kind of as a word and idea, it came into prominence from the Meiji period, and it's taken on different meanings in relation to politics and in relation to conceptions of the Japanese nation state since that time. And one scholar who I find really interesting is the political scientist Shidai Satoshi. And he, in particular, has examined how the Kokutai changed in the post-war. And again, the Kokutai, as I'll explain in a minute, this is a relationship. It's supposed to describe a relationship between emperor and Japanese people, or emperor and his subjects. But Shidai's arguments, and he shares this, I think, in common with scholars writing in English, such as John Dower, a little bit as well, who might not mention it as explicitly. But he really points out the important role of the U.S. in this relationship from the post-war. So I'll explain what this means. And Shidai has written about this in a number of different works, most recently in Kokutai Ron, which was released in 2018, but also in Sengo Seiji o Owaraseru from 2016 and Eizoku Heisen Ron from 2013. As I mentioned, the Kokutai, it's translated sometimes as national polity, but literally means national body. And the basic idea of the Kokutai is that Japan is unique, quote, unique in the world because of its 2,600-year line of unbroken, quote, divine emperors, starting with the mythical first emperor, who is the great-great Jimmu Tenno, who was supposed to be the great-great-grandson of Amaterasu, the sun goddess. So this is this divine lineage. Jimmu himself is a mythical figure, but people on the right, and even in the mainstream as well, actually think that Jinmu really existed. But this is kind of the basis for this idea of this divine rule of emperors, but then through the connections to his Japanese subjects as well, this is really the kernel of various ideas of Japanese superiority in the world, and I would say the fundamental basis for right-wing thought in Japan. And as I mentioned, so, national body, it's describes a relationship between the emperor and his subjects where the emperor forms the head of the nation and the subjects are supposed to be his body. And of course, as is mentioned in the Imperial Rescript to Soldiers and Sailors, for instance, from the late 19th century, that the body can live without its limbs, but not without its head. So the idea is that subjects in this idea of the kokutai, in the conception of the Japanese nation, are supposed to sacrifice themselves for the emperor when asked or required. And this kokutai relationship is supposed to be unreplicatable. It's totally unique in relation to humanity and shared only by ethnic Japanese. The emperor is the spiritual center of Japan. And this idea, as I said, is the basis for Japanese right-wing thought and nationalism. And this worked really well pre-1945, but post-1945, the U.S. made the emperor a symbol, and he renounced, in a way, his divinity. Oh my God, what does this mean for the kokutai then? I mean, big changes here. And we've looked at this in some of my previous talks. But what the U.S. actually did is they strategically worked to keep the emperor so that they could implement their reforms through him. But they tried to take this, kind of downplay this idea of him as a divine figure and just emphasize, or as the head of the state, and emphasize him more as a symbol. So what the U.S. is doing here, as Shidai argues, and in my reading of Shidai's work, then what this means is that the kokutai relationship was changed from the pre-1945 gods, emperor, subjects to the post-1945 America, emperor, and then maybe politics, and citizens. So America basically inserts themselves, they work through the emperor as a symbol, right? So they insert themselves into this parenthetical kind of, man behind the curtain position where they're seen, but they're not seen at the same time. Their presence is felt, but not seen, and they would just completely work through the emperor. And again, this is my conception based on Shidai's arguments. And then this framework where America works through the emperor to, and then positions itself in the kokutai relationship, which is a bond between emperor, government, and citizens, where America positions themselves so tightly in this framework, this becomes Sengo Taisei, basically. This is the post-war framework, in a way. And, of course, the U.S., during the occupation, also worked to remove the focus on militarism from the emperor, so it downplayed the emperor's connections to the military, since it blamed the military for the war and tried to portray the emperor as being blameless. Okay, and so why would Japan allow itself, I guess, in a way, I mean, it didn't have much of a choice, it was completely defeated in World War II, but why would Japanese leaders, even conservative and right-wing leaders in Japan, allow America to be inserted in such a fundamental way into this kokutai relationship? Well, Shidai has an explanation for that, and it's pretty interesting. When Japan aligned itself with the U.S. in the post-war, it allowed Japan to hang on to the myth that it had never actually been defeated in war. There's this idea throughout Japanese history that Japan had never been invaded by foreigners, right? The Mongol invasions of the 14th, 13th century were repelled. by a typhoon or whatever. So there's this idea that it had never been invaded. Well, this doesn't situate very well with the U.S. occupation of Japan post-World War II. But on the other hand, America completely won the war. I mean, it emerged as the world superpower with hardly anyone to challenge it. So Japan was technically the loser, but by latching on to the U.S. so closely, in a way, it kind of won, actually, right? Because it aligned itself with the victor. So this is what I think, this is one of the things that appealed to lots of people in Japan, but especially elite and right leaders in Japan. Moreover, when Japan attached itself to the U.S. so closely, it put Japan in a position where it didn't really have to confront its wartime responsibility, and because it was aligned with the U.S. and not its Asian neighbors, like China, for instance, it allowed Japan to kind of downplay memories of Asian victims, of the war's Asian victims, in popular consciousness. So all of these things very appealing for the Japanese right, and also appealing for the Japanese right was, one, the ability to keep the emperor under U.S. protection, and strong anti-communist sentiment of U.S. elites, shared by Japanese elites. Note that if the USSR had occupied part of Japan, as was originally planned and promised, it most certainly would have spelled the end of the Kokutai, because Russia would have tried the emperor for war crimes. So this is another reason why Japanese elite leaders wanted to surrender to the U.S. early on anyway, before the USSR came in and started to attack Sakhalin or Hokkaido or something. Okay, so then Shidai notes that the Japanese right and the LDP love to criticize the U.S. and appeal to Japanese nationalism that seems to be free of the U.S., but in actuality, they bend over backwards to appease the U.S., even though U.S. leaders, and this is kind of like this Gulf diplomacy, right? You have Koizumi golfing with Bush and Abe golfing with Trump, and, kind of whining and dining them, right? Even though U.S. leaders are only their interest in Japan is just purely pragmatic and opportunistic. They see Japan as they see in Japan in a way to offset the costs of, quote, defending Asia by making Japan pay for U.S. military bases in Japan. And defending Asia here, of course, doesn't really mean defending Asia. It really means defending U.S. hegemony in Asia. So Shidai says in this situation, post-war democracy in Japan is actually just a sham. The U.S. was never interested in democracy in Japan in the first place. It just wanted to keep military bases here. And Japanese LDP leaders acquiesced to this since they were afraid of communism and the left. Also, they wanted to keep down, to suppress the left within Japan. And this was more of a concern probably for them than the USSR actually invading. Because there were a lot of voices in Japan that were very critical of the emperor, especially early on. So they were fearing this internal revolt as well initially against the Kokutai and against the emperor. And the emperor realized this himself, and the Showa emperor pressured Prime Minister Yoshida to accept U.S. bases and urged the U.S. to take Okinawa under its military, quote, protection. Shidai goes on. After the Cold War, the U.S.-Japan security relationship, aka the post-war Kokutai, it was supposed to have lost significance, right? Because the Cold War is over. So who is America defending Japan from? But it continues in its same form as we've seen to today for the past 30 years. And its purpose is simply to strengthen the U.S. In this context, Japan engages in what Shidai calls a kind of political make-believe, seiji gokko, in which it is taboo to criticize Japan's reliance on the U.S. And he cites some examples of this. For instance, in 2015, when Yamamoto Taro noted that all of Abe's policies were in fact included in a 2012 CSIS Armitage Nye report issued by U.S. think tank, and he called Abe out on it. And in response, other Diet members simply said that there were parts that overlapped, and then there was awkward silence that followed. Note also, I would point out here, the annual report recommendations from the government of the United States to the government of Japan, which you can view on the U.S. Embassy website, and I certainly encourage you to do so, in which the U.S. Makes policy recommendations to the Japanese government, and the LDP and other Japanese political parties base many of their policies on these annual documents. For instance, Koizumi's privatizing of the Japan Post, as we saw in an earlier lecture. So Shidai says in this situation, Japan is actually a client state, Zokkoku, or a dependent Juzoku of the U.S. And he shares this view, in fact, with others such as Gavin McCormick and Toyoshita Narahiko. So why is this important? Perhaps some of the significance is already quite apparent just by hearing Shidai's arguments, but I would also say that it demonstrates why Japan maintains a more unequal relationship with the U.S. when compared to similar security treaties that the U.S. maintains with other nations, for instance, Germany. It also explains why the Japanese far right, or Uyoku, is so vehemently pro-America, pro-Trump, pro-right-wing America, etc., etc., etc. Part of this could be what Tesamura Suzuki has called the Internationalization of Nationalism, where right-wing groups form cross-border alliances to push their broader ideology. But also in Japan's case, I think much of this is because the U.S. is seen as A, the protector of the emperor, and B, the defender of capitalism against quote, communism in the left. I put communism in quotes because communism does not exist now, and it has not in world history to this point. And C, their support and alliance with the U.S. allows the right to avoid questions of war responsibility and war crimes against Asians. And note, moreover, that this is not just limited to right parties or the LDP in Japan. It is generally taboo to criticize the U.S. on any side of the political aisle or spectrum. For instance, the liberal CDP party, the Rikken Minshuto's party manifesto, clearly states a desire to and intent to maintain the U.S.-Japan security alliance, as I will point out in a minute. Here's a picture that I took, and it's kind of hard, I realize, to tell what's going on in this picture, but I took this picture at Henoko in Okinawa in 2015. And if you go to Henoko, and sometimes outside of other U.S. bases probably as well, but especially in Henoko, lots of Okinawans are protesting outside of the base and have been for a long time because, for various different reasons, because Okinawa bears the burden of U.S. bases in Japan, and also because of the great environmental damage and destruction that the Henoko base is causing in this very pristine bay where it's being constructed. So Okinawans go out to protest this, but paradoxically, what you see then is the Japanese right wing comes by in these sound trucks, which you can see here, and they have speakers blaring patriotic music and shouting death threats against the protesters, and they come and protect the U.S. military and defend the U.S. military, and they heckle the anti-base protesters. So this, and sometimes they fly American flags and Japanese flags alongside. So this demonstrates how the right wing in Japan is generally, and certainly not now, the contemporary right wing, is generally not anti-US. They're actually very pro-US. And this, I think, most clearly illustrates and evidences Shidai's arguments that this is because the U.S. for them and the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance represents the post-war kokutai itself. So they're really protecting this as the basis of their ideology and post-war Japanese national identity for them. And then here's just a short segment from the manifesto from the website of the Constitutional Democratic Party, which is would be a center-left liberal party in Japan, which reads, when translated in English roughly, we seek to strengthen our partnerships with neighboring nations in the Asia-Pacific region and around the world on the basis of a healthy Japan-America alliance. So again, no political party in Japan is openly declaring that they want to get rid of U.S. military bases or do away with the U.S.-Japan security alliance. This is taboo. And then we have other interesting connections between the Japanese right wing and not just the U.S., but even the U.S. right wing. For instance, in 2017, when former Trump strategist Steve Bannon visited Japan, and he praised Abe, calling him Trump before Trump. And this is from an article, taken directly from an article in the Japan Times by Tomohiro Osaki. And this was sponsored by a right conservative group, the Japanese Conservative Union, at the Japanese Conservative Political Action Conference. And Bannon was praising Abe as, saying he's this great, nationalistic, strong leader. It's fantastic. And then he said, Japan has every opportunity to seize its destiny, to reestablish its national identity, and in true partnership with the United States, reverse what the elites have allowed to happen. So, again, even Bannon in the U.S., which is, quite right-wing, when he comes to visit right groups even in the mainstream political right in Japan, all they really want to do is form stronger bonds with the United States. Because, again, this is the formation of the post-war Kokutai and right-wing thought in post-war Japan. But there has been some anti-U.S. right groups, there have been some anti-U.S. right groups and thinkers in Japan, but mostly in the post-war, and as I'll show, they basically died out in the 70s, so that right-wing thought shifted essentially from having this anti-U.S. element in the early post-war to being very pro-U.S., as we've seen with right-wing groups hosting Steve Bannon and being pro-military bases, etc. And I want to examine the anti-U.S. element of Japanese right-wing thought through the example of Mishima Yukio, because he, I think, in a way, best illustrated this kernel of thought. So it used to be more of a thing in the early post-war, but it was greatly declined and was marginalized and favored the pro-U.S. right. And as I said, it's illustrated through the example of Mishima Yukio. And Shidai Satoshi actually notes in his works that Mishima realized the post-war Kokutai is fundamentally different from the pre-war Kokutai and one which perpetuated subjugation to the U.S. And this was his main point of critique, as was much of the anti-U.S. right's critique in early post-war Japan. He critiqued the post-war constitution, decried Western materialism and democracy, and he hated on communism, and advocated the restoration of the pre-war Kokutai, which he saw as the, quote, national essence of Japan. He formed a right-wing paramilitary group, the Tate no Kai, to launch a coup against the post-war government and to restore the emperor to power. In November 1970, he and his squad stormed the SDF headquarters in Ichigaya and attempted to convince SDF troops to help him overthrow the government. But unfortunately, by this point, and the SDF from its inception basically has been very pro-US. It was formed with the help of the US. So Mishima was laughed off the stage and he committed seppuku, ritual suicide by stabbing oneself in the stomach with a sword in an office of the SDF headquarters. Mishima, in fact, outlined some of his views in his literature. For instance, a 1966 short story, The Voices of the Heroic War Dead, Eirei no Koe. Now, this is a book that is not really read much, I don't think, anymore as part of Mishima's oeuvre, probably because it's so embarrassing to those who like to hang on to a favorable image of Mishima, I personally don't. I don't like Mishima at all. But some people, especially in the foreign community, or I guess outside of Japan, have a positive image of Mishima Yukio, and probably because more of his right-wing works, like Eide no Koe, have not been translated into English. But in Eide no Koe, it talks about a narrator who attends a seance where spirits of the war dead visit him. And these spirits come back to him and say that they have been, quote, betrayed and are full of resentment at the, quote, filth of post-war Japan. And for example, the spirit of a young general who was later executed for his role in the February 26th incident, which is another attempted coup d'etat by the military, said, the true kokutai that we tried to manifest has been completely trampled on, and now Japan floats aimlessly like a buoy drifting far offshore. So again, the kokutai is the element of Mishima and this anti-US right critique. Why? Because, as Shidai said and pointed out, America has inserted itself into the post-war kokutai. And this is what anti-US people like Mishima did not like. And they even decried this as a kind of filth and a degradation of Japan. The young general says that during the war, he and his men believed they were all fighting and dying for the emperor. They thought they would be with the emperor for eternity in a heavenly afterlife. And this is what was promised essentially to lots of military men and was the basic ideology used under the pre-war kokutai, used to convince people to fight and die for the Japanese nation state, that they would be enshrined for eternity under the emperor's benevolent gaze at Yasukuni. Next, the narrator is visited by a young tokotai, or kamikaze pilot, or pilots, who also say that they have been, quote, betrayed. They wanted to realize a place where there was no distance between the Japanese subjects and the emperor/god. This would have justified their deaths. However, after the war, the emperor renounced his divinity, thus making their dream impossible and implicitly denying the meaning of their wartime sacrifices. And so he says, quote, the soul of Japan was lost and that they were, quote, discarded by the emperor. And again, why did the emperor renounce his divinity? This is part of the U.S. strategy to downplay his divinity and to make him into a symbol emperor so that they could use him to work through and implement their reforms. So again, it's all related here to Mishima's critique. So in the context of Mishima's own failed revolution, we can see that his solution to rectifying this situation was to restore the emperor to power not as a symbol favored by the U.S., but as an actual ruler. To achieve this would have meant breaking the post-war relationship with the U.S. But Mishima's ideas outlined in Eide no Koe and his coup attempt failed and were largely rejected both in popular Japanese society and, as we'll see eventually, or as we've already been talking about, by the Japanese right. However, as we'll see in this next slide here, some of this early anti-US sentiment comes out in right-wing thought, again, up until around the 70s. And this is just a short, very brief, incomplete list that I compiled just looking at, there's a Wikipedia list in Japanese, actually, of right-wing political terror attacks in Japan. And so I just pulled some of these from there. For instance, in 1945, on the day that the emperor declared the war over, many right-wing groups and military officers rebelled against this. One was Sonjo Doshikai, which opposed the end of the war and fought Tokyo police in an armed standoff on Atagoyama in Tokyo's, I believe, Minato-ku. Then in October 1960, one of the more famous examples, infamous examples of right-wing political terrorism, right-winger Yamaguchi Otoya assassinated Japan Socialist Party Diet member Asanuma Inejiro during one of his live speeches. In February 1961, Dainihon Aikoku To, another right-wing group member, attacked the home of Chuo Koron. Chuo Koron is a major center-left publisher in Japan. They attacked the home of the head editor at Chuo Koron because Chuo Koron had published a writing which was critical of the emperor. and they stabbed his wife and killed his maid. In December 1961, Kawanami Toyosaku and some former IJA Imperial Japanese Army members plotted an armed overthrow of the government, foiled attempt eventually. In July 1963, Nomura Shusuke attacked and burned down the home of LDP member Kono Ichido. In March 1967, two members of Towakai attacked Okinawa Education Union chief Fukuchi Hiyoaki with swords. And then in November 1970, this is Mishima's failed coup at the SDF headquarters in Ichigaya. In March 1977, four members of Aikoku Doshikai attacked Keidanren headquarters, holding hostages, and this was also an armed standoff with police. They cited Mishima Yukio as an influence. This is a mistake in the date. This should be 1981, not 1891. Between 1981 and 1983, a group later associated with Seiki Hotai set fires outside foreign embassies in the Asahi Shimbun headquarters. Between 1987 and 1990, Seiki Hotai repeatedly attacked Asahi Shimbun headquarters, killing and injuring reporters. In January 1990, the Nagasaki LDP mayor Motojima Hitoshi was shot to death by a right-winger. In October 2002, DPJ Diet member Ishii Koki was stabbed to death by a right-wing Yakuza boss. And in August 2006, a member of the right-wing Dainihon Dohosha burned down the home of former LDP head Kato Koichi. So again, these are just some examples of right-wing political terrorism against all kinds of people. In fact, if you look at this list, opposing the end of the war, against Japan's Socialist Party members, against publishers, against newspaper reporters and newspapers, against members of the LDP, which is the mainstream kind of right conservative party, against the JDP, so kind of all over the place. Anyone who opposes their ideology. The point that I want to stress here is that the right wing in Japan, far right, routinely engages in violent acts of terrorism. And this list doesn't even begin to cover the death threats with which the right and hate speech, which are key components of right-wing strategy and kind of happen on a daily basis. So let's look in more detail at the contemporary far right. And I'm drawing here from an essay by Naoto Higuchi titled The Radical Right in Japan. I believe this is in the Oxford Handbook of the Far Right or Political Right. I can't remember the exact title. Higuchi says that historical revisionism characterizes the Japanese far right. And I want to point out from the beginning here that Higuchi and Shidai's views are a bit different. They overlap in some places, but Shidai does not emphasize historical revisionism so much. It's more typical, I would say, for liberal scholars of Japan to emphasize the aspect of historical revisionism as characteristic of the far right. Shidai is kind of unique in his pointing out how the post-war kokutai is a key element of far-right thought, but many other scholars, like Higuchi, instead focus on historical revisionism, such as, Japan was justified in the Asia-Pacific War, the Greater East Asian War, as they call it. Japan was trying to liberate, quote, liberate Asia from Western imperialism, etc. This is basically the main point of their revisionism. And they want to return to the pre-war days of emperor worship as well, and they deny Japanese aggression in World War II and justify it as the Greater East Asian War. Higuchi says the radical right in Japan can be defined as societal groups or parties that adopt nationalism and some combination of nativism, historical revisionism, traditionalism, and anti-communism, placing them far to the right of mainstream conservatives. Probably, yeah, this sounds generally accurate. Sometimes I don't know how far to the right of mainstream conservatives, but yeah, He then identifies two main groups or types within the contemporary right wing in Japan. The first is pre-war fascist organizations. They're focused on emperor-centered nationalism and anti-communism. They were supposed to have been purged, but actually kept close contacts with conservative post-war leaders. They especially like to attack the Japan Teachers Union as being, quote, communist. But their main target was, during the Cold War, the USSR, and this was related to the ideology of the USSR, which was supposedly communist. But there was also a pragmatic aspect of it, because the Japanese right wing, in opposing the USSR, was also focused on their Northern Territory dispute that Japan still has unresolved today with Russia. And this group says Higuchi has been on the decline since the end of the USSR. The second group he identifies is a religious right, a combination of religious right and war veterans, which includes the Izokukai, or Association of War-Bereaved Families. They demand honor for the war dead and worship at Yasukuni, or demand that people worship at Yasukuni. Higuchi notes that this kind of right-wing group and nationalism is basically anachronistic, since they seek to revive pre-war nationalism. They harken back to a pre-war nationalism. They also appeal back to the legendary first emperor Jimmu, and they in fact achieved some major successes with the restoration of National Foundation Day. The group associated groups include the Association to Protect Japan, 1974, also the Conference to Protect Japan, 1981, which was formed with various far-right groups, business people, and celebrities, etc. I'll talk about this in more detail in a later slide. In 1997, the Association to Protect Japan and the National Conference to Protect Japan merged into the Japan Conference, Nippon Kaigi. Hereafter on this slide, JC, abbreviated as JC, to serve as a far-right headquarters. They worked to revise the basic law of education, urge politicians to worship at Yasukuni, oppose gender equality and voting rights for foreigners. They made a close relationship to the LDP, plus also had elements of a mass movement. The Nippon Kaigi worked through local assembly member councils and to pass ordinances at local levels against gender equality, etc. Other newly emerged far-right groups include, as Higuchi says, the Japan Society for History Textbook Reform. This is most probably closely related to the element of historical revisionism, and this group is abbreviated in Japanese as Tsukurukai. And the grouping and other right-wing groups in this group include celebrities like manga artist Kobayashi Yoshinori. Higuchi says that the long-term rule of the LDP prevented the rise of far-right groups since it was more convenient for them to work with or through the LDP. And this is pretty key, I think, which seems to evidence to me rather pretty close relationship with the LDP. And he says radical right politicians belong to the LDP instead of establishing their own parties. So right groups worked with the LDP, supporting politicians and also putting up their own candidates. Meanwhile, the LDP drew from their voter support base. And these are what he calls the agents, then, who engage in this kind of on-the-ground political mobilization. But there are also what he calls idealists, and they just work to push policies, essentially, push far-right policies like in 1973, when 31 LDP members opposed establishing diplomatic relations with China. The agents and idealists are not really involved in factional LDP disputes because factions are more about personality contests rather than ideological struggles. Higuchi then looks at two examples. One is the North Korean abduction issue. And North Korean agents kidnapped Japanese nationals in the 1970s. And then in 1997, their families or relatives and others formed an association, the National Association for the Rescue of Japanese Kidnapped by North Korea, or Sukuukai, and also Rachi Giden in 1998. What I want to point out here is, first of all, there's more than a 20-year gap between when Japanese nationals were kidnapped by North Korean agents, and when this group supposedly formed to work to get them back was formed. More than a 20-year gap, right? I think this is kind of telling. Suku, Kai, and Nachi Giren, says Higuchi, are radical right groups motivated by anti-North Korea sentiments rather than sympathy with victims. And this is key, right? Because, I mean, it's formed decades later. So, as Higuchi says, like, they have other political motivations other than, actual sympathy, as he says, or concern for the victims. They urge the government, and mainly they urge the government of Japan to adopt a hardline stance against the DPRK. And when Prime Minister Koizumi visited Pyongyang in 2002, this lent a lot of credence to their cause. So then there's also a Diet Member Council of the Japan Conference with about 200 members from the LDP. This gained prominence under Koizumi and Abe, and the majority of Abe's cabinet belonged to the Japan Conference, the Nippon Kaigi. I'll talk about this more in a later slide. Higuchi then looks at some new competition and losses and victories of these contemporary far-right groups. So some of the new competition first has been from the, for instance, Happiness Realization Party, Kofuku Jitsugen no To, which is the political arm of the cult Happy Science. Also, the Sunrise Party of Japan later becomes the Party for the Japanese Kokoro, and the Japan Restoration Party, Ishin no Kai, as well as Your Party. From among these, probably the only one that's really a household name, other than the Happiness Realization Party, which people may know of just because it has such a funny name, would be the Japan Restoration Party, or Ishin no Kai, because they've pretty much been the only one of these parties, new parties, to enter the mainstream and to gain traction and ground around Japan. Higuchi draws on Herbert Kitschelt to suggest that there's a general global trend, and in Japan, for voters to shift from a traditional left-right axis to a left-libertarian versus right-authoritarian axis. And he says moderate conservatives and social democrats merged and formed right-authoritarian groups, and this will become a, quote, niche for the radical right, he thinks. This, I think, is quite true, and I'll explain what this means more in a minute, but it has to do with the connections between right authoritarianism and neoliberalism. Higuchi says then also that Koizumi shifted economics policies rightward, and he's not really clear what this means, but I assume that this is the shift from post-war Keynesianism, pork barrel state spending popular among post-war LDP, to neoliberal austerity and privatization. This allows Koizumi to expand his base, since apparently there's more popular support for this. Higuchi doesn't really explain this, I don't think. He says after this, the LDP and the DPJ economic policies come more closely in line. And this is true because both parties are neoliberal parties, essentially. But this forces then the LDP to adopt alternative social stances to try to distance themselves or distinguish themselves from their opponents, since in terms of economics, there's hardly any difference. And this is where the socio-political rightward shift has become especially apparent. Continuing on from that last category then, Higuchi talks about Ishin no Kai, which was formed under Hashimoto Toru, the mayor of Osaka. He combined media savvy with neoliberal economic policies and nationalistic socio-political stances. He gained much support, 20.4% in the 2012 lower house elections. And the JRP best seems to illustrate Kitschelt's idea of a, quote, winning formula for the far right, which is a combination of, quote, market liberalism and authoritarianism. This is quite important, I think. The Sunrise Party has been less successful. It ran on anti-immigration nativist platform, i.e. kick out the foreigners, blah, 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 that kind of stuff. They've been less successful since they forgot to combine market liberalism and just stress nativism, and Kitschelt implies that this would be a losing formula. But discursively, the far right might actually be winning, because much of their discourse has been accepted in mainstream levels, just like Trump worked to kind of make a lot of kind of shift the political discussion in the U.S. toward the right as well. So even if the LDP seeks to distance themselves from extreme nativist stances, they've adopted a lot of the same discourse, I think. And Higuchi tracks discourse a bit to determine far-right ideological enemies. So during the Cold War, for instance, the discourse was dominated by the USSR, obviously, which was seen as the main, quote, enemy. But after the Cold War, it's been China, South Korea, and North Korea, which have come to dominate the discourse of the right in terms of foreign policy and who is made into the enemy other. And then the increase of history-related issues from the mid-1990s. This was a backlash, as we've seen in other lectures, against South Korea and Chinese victims speaking out against their wartime victimization by the Japanese military and state. As well, though, in the right wing in Japan is protesting against that, but also they're protesting against how the Japanese government basically apologized in the early 1990s for lots of its wartime responsibility. So they were first concerned then about the, quote, kind of anti-Japanese attitudes of its neighbors, but it later morphed into a nativist movement as well. Okay, and then he looks at the kind of net uyo, this like uyoku right wing, people who just hang out on the internet and like troll people. Basically it's a lot easier to spew your hate if you're kind of disguising yourselves behind some kind of, incognito identity and whatnot. But there's been some pushback against the right wing as well. Generally, nativist political violence and hate have drawn negative public reactions. For instance, in 2010, Zaitoku-kai, talk about this group in a minute, but they're an anti-Korea group. Members were arrested for harassing Korean school students at a Korean school in Kyoto. Members were ordered to pay compensation to the victims. And also, anti-racism groups have formed counter-protest to the Zaitoku-kai and other right groups. And nativist groups, much of their hate speech, which formed kind of the key element of one of their, strategies, I guess. Much of this was deemed illegal and punishable under the 2016 anti-hate speech law. So in conclusion, Higuchi questions whether people in Japan support the far right because of economic conditions. I would say partly yes, they do, but Higuchi says no, he thinks instead that support for the right comes from feelings of wanting to defend Japan against, quote, anti-Japanese countries. But, who knows? Could be a combination of a lot of these plus other things. I just want to present then another example, which Higuchi does not mention, but which I have noticed in recent years. And this is the Japan First Party, kind of, again, borrowing from like Trump's discourse of America First. And this is a picture of members of the Japan First Party advertising outside Kyoto's Demachi Yanagi Station that I took in November 2018. The Japan First Party was founded by Sakurai Makoto, head of the far-right anti-Korean Zaitoku-kai group in 2016. And I pulled a screenshot from their platform in regards to their policies on immigration and foreigners. And I just very loosely kind of translated some of these points. They're pretty, I think, kind of shocking, I guess, and definitely worth focusing on. So they oppose foreign immigration, just outright. They oppose foreigners participating in politics. They oppose giving health insurance to foreigners, as well as other forms of social welfare. They want to penalize foreigners in Japan for participating in, quote, political activities, seiji katsudo. I don't know what this means, but seiji katsudo is a very loose, ambiguous phrase, which could mean pretty much anything, including this lecture that I'm giving right now, probably. They want to end scholarships for foreign exchange students studying in Japan, and they even want to prohibit the Japanese media from reporting on foreigners in Japan. But this would be an example of a far-right political party, which is fringe, for sure, but they still manage to get on the political stage, and they have a presence. They're working through established liberal norms, essentially, of political participation. Not yet, to this point, to my knowledge, engaging in outright violence, although Zaitokukai, there are connections there, do link them to other forms of definitely of violence and death threats and whatnot. But, here they are, just standing on a street, kind of doing their thing. Okay, and then this is an image that I got from, I did not take this image, but this is from a March 2003 demonstration by the Zaitokukai members in Tokyo. This was taken by, the photo credits are go to Kudashita Yuki, who has this posted on Wikipedia, and there's a link to this here. But there were a lot of pictures taken of this demonstration, actually, and other Zaitokukai demonstrations, and they attracted kind of widespread media attention because there was so much hate speech and death threats coming from Zaitokukai members. As you can see, this woman carrying a sign which says, the latter part of it says, well, first it says, kill all of our former enemies, and then it says, kill all Koreans. And the Zaitokukai stands for Association of Citizens Against the Special Privileges of the Zainichi, which are Koreans who have resided in Japan for many generations. It was founded by Sakurai Makoto in 2014. Again, same founder of Japan First Party. And they're a violent anti-foreign hate group. All right. And finally, I want to look at some articles. One by Herbert Bix, which connects the rise in neo-nationalism to neoliberalism. And Higuchi also kind of talked about this a little bit, but I think this is also very important. It kind of ties, again, far right in Japan to the US as one of the pioneers of the neoliberal model in the world. So this is pretty interesting. I want to look at this. So first, Herbert Bix wrote an article, Japan Under Neo-Nationalist Neoliberal Rule, in the Asia-Pacific journal Japan Focus in April 2013. And he asked, what did the LDP return to 2012 signify? Return to power in 2012 signify? And part of it was there's this split between right parties like Ishin no Kai, and this indicated that the LDP had decided against a populist platform in favor of neoliberal reforms. And Abe's cabinet combined the mainstream and the far right, and Bix says they were all committed, people in the cabinet were all committed to the full neoliberal economic agenda at home and an expanded liberal interventionism abroad. Bix predicted in the article Abe's changes to Article 9 by to allow collective self-defense. This happened in 2015, and Bix is writing in 2013. So a lot of very accurate foresight going on in this article. He predicted only token changes to the U.S.-Japan alliance, and ones which would allow Japan to take a greater role in this alliance. Also, this largely came true. And then Foreign Minister in the Abe cabinet, Kishida Fumio, wanted to strengthen the U.S.-Japan military alliance, but he also decried the, quote, Tokyo Trials version of history where Japan was, where Japan's war crimes were tried, and Japan was, clearly determined as the aggressor. So there's this combination of deference to the U.S., which Japanese leaders, that's their main focus, and then in order to kind of pander to their base, they spout this they take this neo-nationalist line, right? Japan was right in World War II and Yasukuni is awesome, like that. Others in Abe's cabinet were all strong religious nationalists, worshipping at Yasukuni, and historical and constitutional revisionists. But Note that the US has actually basically favored constitutional revision throughout the post-war while tending to overlook religious nationalism. For instance, the US kept the emperor and allowed Yasukuni to stay. So the US is not so interested in history issues insofar as they don't impinge on foreign relations too much. But constitutional revision may also be predicting a revised relationship with the US, for instance, anticipating the decline of the US empire already underway. Tanagi Sadakazu in the Abe cabinet presented the LDP draft constitution, which we looked at in an earlier lecture. It wanted to turn the emperor from a symbol, from just a symbol to the actual head of state, or Genshu. And Bix says, since the symbol monarchy is actually a symbol of Japan's subordination to the US, this could be an eventual major shift. And here Bix also identifies the post-war Kokutai as being predicated on a relationship with the US and aligns himself with the work of Shidai Satoshi that we looked at earlier. Others like Ishiba Shigeru and Abe himself also sought to strengthen the office of the prime minister through, quote, emergency measures. This is the authoritarian element of the Abe kind of neo-nationalist, neoliberal regime. Bix also predicted the state secrets law, which punished whistleblowers and media for reporting on anything seen as damaging to the government. And then Bix goes on to look more closely at Abe's neoliberalism. Abenomics was basically a neoliberal upward transfer of wealth from the public sector or populace to the ruling class elites, such as banks and the heads of banks and large corporations. It was propelled by a weak yen, which helped Japanese exports but not local consumers, a rise in consumption tax, which shifted the tax burden from corporations to average households, and cuts to social programs. But there was a problem. Much of the LDP received its support from the farm lobby and other protected industries. They promised to oppose the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which basically failed but was adopted in a slightly revised form. So there's this, the LDP originally, has it has this strong base, which is not, they very clearly do not want neoliberal reforms and deregulation and stuff. But LDP leaders themselves actually do. So they're kind of working against their base, and they have to try to, the problem for them, or the task for them was, try to figure out a way to convince, I guess, or deceive their base essentially into supporting these policies. Bix also traces Japanese neoliberalism to Nakasone and privatization, monetarism, deregulation, leading to speculation on inflated stock prices, the bubble, which collapsed, resulting in unequal income distribution, inequality, economic stagnation, unemployment, etc. We've looked at this in a previous lecture, and we'll look at the effects of inequality in Japan in our next lecture. But for instance, the relative poverty rate in Japan in 2007 was 15.7%. In 2007 and 2008, 20 million Japanese were living below the poverty line. He notes a neoliberal tendency in Japan toward, quote, corporatism, hostility to democracy, and authoritarianism. This aligns very closely with other studies of neoliberalism that we looked at, including the work of David Harvey. Neoliberalism, contra its rhetoric, relies on increased government intervention in the form of deregulation of financial markets and bailing out failed banks and financial institutions with taxpayer money. They also favor oligarchic control in Japan in the form of the nuclear industry and the Iron Triangle, not to mention increased secrecy and surveillance for the purpose of hiding massive profits, such as tax havens and financial fraud. These authoritarian neoliberal policies of austerity, gutting public services, reduced wages, etc., have had the effects of alienating people, and in terms of politics, this has resulted in disenfranchising of the voting populace, as evidenced in low voter turnout rates in Japan. What might the U.S.-Japan relationship look like moving forward? And this is something I'll, again, touched on in Bix's article, and I've just put U.S.-Japan relationship 2.0 here. U.S. and LDP elite wanted to join the TPP, as I mentioned, against the wishes of the LDP's base. The TPP would have forced open markets, deregulated finance, etc., and made it more difficult for states to stand up to corporate power. This did not really work out, though, because of Trumpism in the United States, which shifted policy a little bit marginally. But again, now Trump is no longer president, basically. So yeah, we'll see where this goes, but probably back to more a more kind of neoliberal policy, I would imagine, under Biden. And then the U.S. wants Japan to toe the U.S. line. So it supports a buildup of military power in Japan within the Washington Consensus, but it doesn't want Japan to whip up trouble with its neighbors, China and Korea, over the Senkaku Islands, for instance, because it doesn't want to be dragged into a military conflict where it has literally nothing to gain. Also, if Japan were, for instance, to be dragged into a military conflict with China and Korea, it would quickly reveal that the U.S. military in Japan has absolutely no interest in protecting Japan either. Also, the U.S. needs to balance, and I think this is key as well, its strategic alliances with other Asia-Pacific nations, some of which are not so enthused about Japan's military buildup. This is key, I would say. And then the last article that I want to look at is by Tawada Yoshifumi, called What is the Aim of Nippon Kaigi?, published in the Asia-Pacific Journal, Japan Focus, November 2017. Tawada Yoshifumi is a longtime civic activist, friend of famed historian Ienaga Saburo, and has been tracking not just the Japanese right wing, but especially the Japanese political right's attempts to control education, to push education in Japan in a more patriotic right-wing direction, and to exert their efforts at historical revisionism in history textbooks. But Tawada starts out by looking at the Nippon Kaigi, the Japan Conference, hereafter NK, the largest right-wing group in Japan, as I mentioned, formed in 1977, which included business people, celebs, religious figures, politicians, etc. It was formed from the two groups Nihon no Mamorukai, formed in 1974. They were a religious nationalist group and worked to reinstate the use of era names into law in 1979. Era names meaning, like right now, we're in Reiwa, and so taking the name, but before that was Heisei, Showa, right? So taking names from the emperor to refer to what year you're in. This actually wasn't a thing in Japan, in post-war Japan, until 1979, when it became law because these right-wing religious groups pushed for it to be. Then in 1981, they reorganized into a separate group, Nihon no Mamoru Kokumin Kaigi, seeking to revise the constitution and restore the power of the emperor. They combined education, revising textbooks, historical revisionism, constitutional revision, restoring power to the emperor, and defense, restoring the Japanese military. In 1984, they published a high school textbook which passed the MOE screening as well. And this is kind of a precursor of later history textbook reform issues. And then these two groups in 1987, as we looked at, merged into Nippon Kaigi. And Nippon Kaigi set up local prefecture headquarters around the country, and all kinds of different committees as well to focus on different policy issues like constitutional and historical revisionism. They maintain close links to politicians. In 1997, LDP Obuchi Keizo and Mori Yoshido formed the Roundtable Conference of Diet members of Nippon Kaigi. At that time, 189 Diet members were participated in this group, but in 2015, there were already 281 Diet members who were part of Nippon Kaigi, or 40% of the entire Japanese Diet. And 80% of Japan's cabinet was Nippon Kaigi members. So Tawada says that effectively Nippon Kaigi is, quote, now running Japanese politics. In 2002, the Ministry of Education introduced mandatory moral education for elementary and middle schoolers, emphasizing patriotism and love for Japan. And in 2015, the Abe cabinet made moral education a regular classroom subject, just like mathematics or geography. But again, this is more morality classes, which have no scientific basis, of course, unlike mathematics or geography. Nippon Kaigi has also an organization for women which opposes gender equality and policies like separate surnames for married couples and, quote, gender equal education. There's also a youth arm of Nippon Kaigi, the Nihon Seinen Kyogikai, and also, yes, then the local groups, Nippon Kaigi Chiho Gin Renmei, which has, at the time of that Tawada was writing this article, that counts among its members 2 governors, 31 mayors, 791 assembly members, and 850 local heads. So Nippon Kaigi basically dominates many local prefectural assemblies. For instance, in Yamaguchi Prefecture, 70% of prefectural assembly members are Nippon Kaigi members. They work especially hard to get local boards of education to adopt right-wing history textbooks. Also, they try to get schools to display the national flag and to get kids to sing the national anthem. The purpose of calling patriotism in young kids, of course, is to gain support for the national army, for a national army, for the self-defense forces, which they hope will become a national army, and loyalty to the state, but also to giant capitalist corporations as well, by fostering this idea that Japanese morality is centered around some kind of, hard work, diligent, unquestioning workers. So this is a combination of nationalism and neoliberalism where those two interests align. They also participated in an effort, or launched an effort, to collect 10 million signatures to revise the Constitution. This was done through the Jinja Honcho, Association of Shinto Shrines, with 80,000, which counts 80,000 shrines nationwide under its umbrella. And Nippon Kaigi then put its signature petitions next to donation boxes at shrines where visitors would pray. So it's front and center, everyone would see them. Then in 2015, they held what was titled a 10,000 person convention at Nippon Budokan. We must now revise the Constitution. Actually, 11,300 people attended, and Prime Minister Abe sent a video message of love. So, in conclusion, what can we determine from this brief history of the right wing, the far right and the political right, in post-war Japan? And I acknowledge this has been an impartial history. Of course, I couldn't touch on everything in this brief lecture, and to my knowledge, we're still waiting for an in-depth English study of this subject. But I think based on just this talk alone, we can arrive at some perhaps tentative conclusions. The Japanese right wing has been shaped by its connections to the US. There are dual tendencies within this. On the one hand, loyalty and submissiveness to the US, this is the client state element, and on the other hand, loyalty to and nostalgia for the pre-war emperor system. The former of these two have typically been stronger. This is because the US-Japan alliance in Japan and Japanese leaders in the right wing shared their interests of anti-communism, keeping the emperor and Yasukuni, downplaying wartime aggression and responsibility, free market authoritarianism, and neoliberalism. So this is where elites in US and Japan, their interests basically align, and this is why they're still maintaining the US-Japan alliance. So outright anti-US sentiment is rare due to the above reasons, but it used to be there used to be a stronger anti-US faction of the right. It was basically marginalized after Mishima Yukio's failed coup. However, the nativist right instead bashes especially Chinese and Koreans today, as evidenced by groups like the Zaitokukai. Leaders like Nakasone, Koizumi, and Abe have also pushed for a strong neo-nationalist, neoliberal agenda. They seek to revise the Constitution and to return to the pre-war emperor worship within the framework of the US-Japan alliance. This would, though, mean revising the post-war Kokutai if Shidai's arguments are to be believed. And so I end my talk here, and I kind of, maybe there are some open questions as well, where, in regards to where things will go from here. But in any case, the right wing, I would say, remains very strong in Japan. Some would argue it has been getting stronger and stronger. And an increase in nativist groups like the Japan First Party is certainly very troubling in the way that they're able to rather easily enter into the mainstream liberal political process. Higuchi, saw one of the kind of defining features of the right in Japan contemporary right as being historical revisionism. But I would stress that economic issues are, in fact, also playing a very important role in this. The increasing impoverishization of much of the Japanese populace, and they're having to bear the burden of neoliberal austerity reforms and cuts to the public sector, and also declining real wages and a stagnating economy as well. I would say that all of these things, in fact, are very important, and as Herbert Bix also pointed out and emphasized, that this as well is in the background of this rightward shift and a lot of the emergence of right-wing nativist groups. So thank you very much for listening.